You are psychologically torturing these injured people who were trying to do their part on behalf of a team because you told them that's what they had to do.
And
So my point is that is a sick system that would tell people this was their obligation as a member of a team, and then when it didn't work out, pretends that they're not sick.
and
Right? It's diabolical.
it's diabolical. And one of the phrases I keep using is it just seems like the world has gone mad. And it's I want to refer that the world went mad in COVID and all these behaviors that we're talking about. And I agree with you. I attribute the madness that has descended upon all us is from unrelenting propaganda and censorship. We've been sickened by the information that we need in order to live and live correctly and in harmony, right? And yet the information has been poisoned. When we started talking about like at the level of the journals and all of this, and you brought up another point, which is it was so bad. The propaganda and censorship supporting this vaccine campaign was so horrible and powerful that you saw this phenomenon, because you kind of touched on it, where anyone close to the unvaccinated, I would call them vaccine adjacent, were attacked. And the one example are people who got vaccinated and tried to speak up about their injuries. They were literally immediately lumped in with the ire and attacks were directed at them. And for me, one of the most memorable and heartbreaking examples. I don't know if you've heard of this case, but there was a professional mountain bike racer, Kyle. I can't remember his last name, but he filmed himself in his car one day talking about how his career was over. He was really sick and he was crying because he had been trying to talk about his injury, not only for help, but also, I guess, to tell others. And he couldn't believe the amount of people attacking him and the amount of anger and ferocity directed at him for him just trying to talk about his experience. And, that's how bad that got. People who got vaccinated were being attacked.
Well, I have become somewhat infamous for the catchphrase, it's worse than that. But it's worse than that because on the one hand, you've got this mountain biker, and I don't remember his name, but I do remember the case, who speaks out about just a fact of his life. Mm-hmm. He was a mountain biker. Now what is he? Right? He doesn't know. He's understandably broken up about that. And what's more, this has implications for his longevity. And, it's a tragic case, and it is an exemplar of a pattern that is much more widespread. But the other thing, you probably saw Rav Arora's recent piece about a journalist, I think an editor at a publication, and the publication was decidedly enthusiastic about vaccines and mandates, and the editor had a severe vaccine injury, an immediate one, right? And these things get much more difficult for us to grapple with when they're delayed, right? A delayed cancer, for example, the room to pretend that it's not downstream or the room for there to be statistical noise or whatever. But this was a case where somebody had an immediate and intense adverse event that was cardiac in nature. It was myocarditis, I believe. And anyway, the point is that person has apparently still not come forward, and the publication that they worked for hasn't acknowledged that it was championing these vaccines, and then right on their doorstep had an event that ought to have caused them to think, hey, wait a minute, that seems pretty unlikely. If these events are vanishingly rare that one of our own would have had it, maybe we should look into how widespread they are. So anyway, my point is our impression in the public of how common these events are is downstream of a campaign to punish and intimidate people who've had these events so that they will talk about them as little as possible or not at all.
Yeah.
which leaves the false impression that they were much safer than they actually were.
Yeah. I mean, I also think, Brett, when you bring up the example of that editor and that outlet or whatever news source that was, not talking about it, that seems very governmental and military censor. I mean, it seems like everyone got the memo in the media. Thou shalt not speak ill of these vaccines. I mean, with very few exceptions, most media sources never even brought up the possibility that these vaccines weren't safe. And the most absurd and dystopian are the thousands and thousands of reports of young people dropping dead, athletes, broadcasters on television, comedians on stage. I mean, all walks of life, many times caught on camera. Young, healthy people out doing, like, once you're outside doing an activity, by the way, that's a pretty good comment on your underlying health. Okay. Like, I mean, sick people are not doing what these people do, particularly athletes. And so you have these,
Yeah.
and then the ages. I am an expert in sudden cardiac death. As an ICU specialist, that was one of the patient populations I had to take care of, those that survived CPR. And it's so incredibly rare for young people to drop dead. And you have legions of newspaper reports, report after report after report after report of no anteceding event, and the vaccine is never mentioned, never once mentioned as a possibility. And the consistency under which that is true. And I used to read those reports. I literally would skim them to see if the journalist writing about this tragic and unexpected death of a young person, a high schooler, whatever the case is, I was just waiting to see if they would just, unclear cause, maybe, could it be the vaccines? Or there's no mention in any of those articles that's a vaccine. It's just a normal, rare occurrence.
Now, I'm glad you bring this up. I've done a lot of thinking about it. The problem here, I believe, is also obviously downstream of the same propaganda campaign we've been talking about.
Yeah.
The problem is these events are extremely rare, naturally. The vigilance about finding these events and pointing to them is now unusually high.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So to the extent that this happens very rarely and you generally don't hear about it, but now it broadcasts an individual anomalous death broadcast to a much wider audience, one has to ask the question, is what I'm seeing an artifact of sampling a much larger population? Now, I don't believe it could be, and you, as an ICU specialist, are in a much better position to say that you believe the level of this is unusual. However, here's where I think this goes. We have to be cautious because there will be deaths that we hear about that contribute to our sense that vaccines have created a lot of injuries in young people.
True.
That actually are just anomalies. They may be some other environmental exposure to something novel, but maybe it's not the vaccine. But here's the important point. This isn't a tough question to study.
No.
Right? This is what science does. And if we were really interested in the question of, well, is there an anomalous pattern of young people dropping dead?
There is.
If there's that pattern, and it is downstream of the vaccines, we can find out if we want to. And what we seem to be doing is avoiding finding out.
That's absolutely correct. But let me speak to that, Brett, because in my mind, that question has been soundly answered with data. And interestingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, it doesn't come out of the medical sciences, that data. That data is coming out of the life insurance industry. And Ed Dowd's work on this with his team I mean, when you hear these numbers, I mean, and how that story broke and how that data came out was really interesting. You know, there was a newspaper article. I can't time it. It's probably over a year ago, where a CEO of a life insurance company, One America, was apparently talking to a chamber of commerce. Like it was just a meeting at a chamber of commerce. And he lets it slip that they saw, I think it was either 38 or 40% rise in death claims in the age group from 18 to 64 from 2020 to 2021. So in one year, and he said in that same meeting that in his business, a 10% rise in mortality in that age group from one year to the next would be statistically a 1 in 200 year event. That's how rare 10% is. And here he is telling a group of folks that this $100 billion, $1 million company saw a 38% rise. And the timing of the rise perfectly matches the vaccine rollout. That, you know, the data showing how many people we've lost from the workforce, actually from death, is truly alarming. And so it's like we already know. I'm sorry, Brett. I mean, for me, those vaccines are a humanitarian catastrophe. They've caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. And you're right, though. We don't. No one's talking about it.
Well, look, I don't disagree with you about what the most parsimonious interpretation of the evidence that I've seen is. I think it's quite clear. But the point I'm trying to make is, to the extent there are many people out there who still don't believe there is a pattern, there ought to be an obsession with doing the most deliberate and careful study possible to discover the nature of that pattern, right? We're still giving these shots to people. I can't understand that. We're still giving these shots to young people, right? That couldn't be a more medically irresponsible thing to do. If it tried healthy young people, why would you give them a shot for a disease that does not put them at substantial risk? So anyway, I'm not doubting. I'm not doubting the evidence from the insurance industry. What I'm doubting is our ability to look at the reports of sudden death in people and to know the contribution of vaccines versus the contribution of the level of interest.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I mean, that you're right. Anybody should be asking the question.
Yep.
We should be asking a question, and like we ask lots of questions in science, we have ways of answering it, and there's a process in which to do it, and it's not being done.
We have entire institutions full of people who trained to be able to answer such questions, and we are not pointing them at this one.
Nope.
Which is shocking.